In our last video, we explored the optional rule of spell points, explaining how they worked in regular play and highlighting some key issues with the system as it's presented on page 288 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. In this video, we will analyze some other point-based magic systems and attempt to improve the system for spell points in the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons. So, if you haven't watched the last video, I suggest you go back and watch it first if you want to learn how the base rules work. Otherwise, let's get into trying to fix spell points. With all the issues and problems discussed in our last video, it begs the question of whether or not it's even possible to run a fair and balanced point-based spellcasting system in D&D. But there must be a way to run a point-based spellcasting system, as games have been doing it since the earliest games ever made. So, we should have a look at some other ways such systems have been handled, and we'll start with a way that Wizards of the Coast themselves have tried. I would like to draw your attention to a moment to the Mystic class. Now before you click off, I'm not here to toot the Mystic's horn. I'm just using it to set up a premise for a better style of point-based casting, as that is what the Mystic would have had. Without deep diving the class, the Mystic had its resource of psi points, which could be spent to activate one of the properties of its psionic disciplines, which they could learn and were basically their equivalent of spells, but could only spend points within their psi limit. There are a lot of comparisons that can be drawn between spell points and the Mystic, with one key difference: the Mystic's progression was not linear. Both its psi points and its psi limit increase exponentially at lower levels, then teeter off and halt progressing at higher levels, as opposed to spell points which slowly and consistently raise spell level maximums and, outside of a few bumps, rather consistently award the character with additional spell points as they level. What's more, Mystics learned much fewer disciplines than casters learned spells, and disciplines were actually designed with a point-based style of casting in mind, albeit not designed perfectly, seeing as the Mystic never went alive. Even with Mystic being that way, we can't go overhauling the entirety of how spells and spellcasting classes work just in order to make a point style system work, nor should we mess with what character levels can cast any given level of spell. We also can't repeat what they did with higher level spells and limit the number of times a spell of any given level can be cast, because if we went around and put a limit of how many spells of any given level can be cast, we would effectively be achieving an identical end result to spell slots, just without the actual slots themselves. Given slots, the whole point was that they limited how many times you could cast a spell of any given level. For our second example, I'll outline a way that I once tried to do spell points when playing around with this concept. A system that gives characters spell die to calculate spell points, in the same way that a hit die is used to calculate hit points. The spell die was always a d4 for spellcasters, but the rate at which you gained additional dice was determined by your class. Every level for full casters, every 2 levels for half casters, and every 3 levels for quarter casters. The exception was Warlock, whose die increased progressively from a d4 to a d12, but they got very few die total. A character's maximum spell points started as being equal to the highest roll of the die, plus their spellcasting modifier, and increased as they gained additional dice through leveling. They could either roll the die and gain points equal to the result, or add half plus 1 like you do with hit points. They could also expend them on a short rest to recover spell points, however they did not add their modifier to the die when they recovered points or leveled up. Although the Warlock rolled all their spell die every short rest, where everyone else had to spend them as you do hit die. However, under this system, spells cost a little bit more than they do for the base spell point rules. A spell of first level costs 3 points to cast, and a second level jumps straight to 5, for example. I didn't initially include a limit on how many high level spells could be cast per day, but I did add it in later. So there are essentially 2 things that I learned while using this system. One of my design goals with it was to try and preserve the full daily casting potential that a full caster would get from spell slots, but to make sure that they couldn't hold it all at once and needed to rest to gain access to the remainder of their points. The spell dice worked out to give players about half of what they would normally get under the base spell point rules, and by rolling their spell dice over a short rest, they could gain access to the other half of their points, essentially being unable to have all of them available at once. This really makes the game very different. Short rests became much more important under this system, in order to gain their full casting potential for the day. Maybe that idea appeals to you in your games, maybe it doesn't. All I can really say is that this type of system can work if you adjust the style of pacing of your games for it. I still have these rules and I'm displaying them on screen now. YouTube doesn't really like it when people link things in the description, so maybe I'll put it in the pinned comment instead. It's by no means a perfect system, but it's really not a terrible one either in my opinion. The main appeal of this system is the spell dice themselves, creating that parallel between hit points and spell points. So bringing the number of points they have down that low isn't a perfect solution, but the number they get from the base rules is still too high. The second thing I learned from the spell dice system though is having the cost of each spell increase exponentially is a good thing. However, since the base spell point system awards points exponentially at the same rate, these factors combine together to cause the issues we discussed in the last video. The reason an exponential increase in the cost of spells is good as opposed to a linear one is because it better reflects the power curve of leveled spells. Since the difference in power between spells increases as you get to higher levels, a 9th level spell not being equal to 9 first level spells, for example, likewise how 3 fireballs isn't equal to 1 meteor swarm. So having the higher cost better reflects that, but this doesn't work properly in the base spell points because character are always given enough spell points to cast all the spells that they would have been able to normally under the spell slot system. Their spell point maximum needs to increase in a way that lets this power curve be felt, not in a way that mirrors the curve like it does with the base rules. Now, with both of those examples aside, we can get back to actually designing a new system that factors in the flaws of all the others. As I said before, we can't just put a limit on how many spells of each level can be cast. If we're going to fix this system, we need to focus on the problems that we're actually needing to fix. Those being casting more high-level spells than normally possible, and casting many more low-level spells than normally possible. In order to do that, we have to figure out what we can actually play around with. After preserving the things we listed previously, we still have how many spell points a caster gets, and how many they have to spend in order to cast a spell of any given level. However, we shouldn't just emulate the approach that the Mystic took. We can also theoretically place a limit on how many spells can be cast in total in one way or another. Given the versatility offered by point-based spellcasting, saying that the character should get less points overall is not unfair. Using all that we've learned from our previous examples, let's keep the same cost for spells of each level from the Dungeon Master's Guide and try another fixed rate approach to the number of spell points a character has. As we pointed out before, there's a couple of bumps in the base spell point rules progression. The reason these bumps are there is because these are the levels where multiple spell slots would have been acquired at once had we been using the spell slot system. Since it's going to be difficult to get rid of those bumps and still have the system be balanced, we're going to focus on trying to make the progression feel more consistent, but we're also going to have to take a moment to talk about the breakpoints of point-based spellcasting. Breakpoints are essentially the significant thresholds where if you divide a number by a certain amount, you will get a whole number. For point-based spellcasting, our breakpoints would be what amount of spell points translate into the number of spells that can be cast of each given level. We'll start by focusing mainly on 5th level spells as they were the long-term issue at later levels. Since it costs 7 points to cast a 5th level spell, if we only want a caster to be able to use, say, 4 of those in a day, should they commit all their points to it, a 10th level character should have less than 35 spell points. This makes the difference between 34 and 35 much greater than the singular spell point, hence why we can refer to it as a breakpoint. And we need to repeat this mentality across the first 10 character levels. But since we can only cast one spell of each level of 6th and higher, adding up the cost of those spells tells us how many points should be gained between levels 11 and 18. So to recap, levels 1 through 10 should result in accruing no more than 34 spell points, and levels 11 through 18 should grant an additional 43. So this is our baseline of breakpoints, and we can use it to start figuring out how many additional points should be given for each new level. Since we need to preserve these bumps at the odd levels, and full casters typically don't get features at those levels anyway, we're going to set a rule that more spell points are required at odd levels than at even levels. Since we want characters to be able to cast at least 4 of their highest level spells, we'll start by setting the odd levels to 4 times the cost of said slot level. I'll spare you all the math that I used for this next part, but if we alternate between +2 and +5 points every even and odd level respectively, that leaves us with 34 points exactly at level 10. However, you'll notice that levels 3 and 5 drop below the minimum breakpoint, so we'll fix that by increasing both of those levels by 1, which does bring us up to 36 points at 10th level, but that can just be a little bonus we afford the players. Just as a treat. To work out the points for levels 11 through 18, we'll split the cost of each new spell level that they acquire and increase the total points they have relative to that, always awarding +3 at the even levels and the difference at the prior odd level. This does leave one last question though. What about the additional 5th, 6th, and 7th level spell slots that are typically gained in the last 3 levels? We're going to omit them from our spell point progression, reason being, the purpose they served in spell slot progression does not suit spell point progression, as we can already cast more 5th level spells than is warranted. So instead, we'll just add +10 and then +5 as an arbitrary increase. However, if you as a DM want your players to be able to cast that extra 6th and 7th level spell every day, you can raise the limit from 1 to 2 when they reach those respective levels. Alright then, so looking at what we have now, this is obviously no small reduction in the total spell uptime a character can have, but as I said before, something should be given in exchange for the versatility of spell points, and since we can't really stunt spell progression, uptime is the best next thing to attack. Not to mention, the power curve is much more consistent now. If a DM wants to award some more spell uptime, perhaps a passive feature similar to Arcane Recovery for all spellcasters would help, or maybe adding the equivalent of mana potions instead, as most video games with MP systems feature one or both of these things. So that's how and why I adjust the actual quantity of spell points and what impact that has on the caster themselves. Now onto the wording changes. First, let's make the level calculations for half and quarter casters round up. Obviously, they don't need to be nerfed further, especially under the changes I've made to the system. Second, Warlocks. I won't walk you through the full process I did to work out how many points they get per level, but it's essentially the same method. Add up the point costs of the slots that they would have had, keep breakpoints in mind, smooth out the bumps, and end with roughly the same values. However, I don't recommend using spell points for Warlocks in any case, as it's just a massive buff to them. So now that we've factored in breakpoints and figured out what spell point maximums will keep full casters under a certain amount of high level spells cast, the only real issue left to solve now is casting too many low level spells. There are a lot of low level utility spells like Shield, Aid, Longstrider, Absorb Elements, and so forth that break outside of a spell slot system. However, after actually running the numbers, with the amount of spell points that a caster has under the new totals, they would only be able to cast a number of first level spells roughly equal to the number of total slots that they would have had. Which is technically still more, but it's much better than what the DMG was giving them. So, we effectively have solved the issue of casting too many low level spells as well, in that they can cast roughly the same number of spells as if they had used all of their slots for something like Shield. So that only leaves the question, what do you think of this alternative rule set for spell points? Why do you like or not like it? Have something better that you use in your own games? Head down to the comments and add your thoughts to the conversation, and I'll heart any good responses. And with that, we find ourselves at the end of this video. I'll leave the final rules that we put together up on screen here, and we can discuss them further in the comments as well. But ultimately, the best advice I can really give in regards to spell points is just don't. Spell slots work. They're a little hard to wrap your head around at first when you first begin playing, but once you get into the swing of it, they're a pretty reliable system. Beyond that though, subscribe if you want to stick around for more D&D rules discussions like these. Thank you for watching, a fine day to you, and may the dice be ever in your favor.